In the glittering world of ballet, a star vanishes. Elise Varnier, the prima ballerina, disappears after a breathtaking performance, leaving only whispers of envy, betrayal, and ambition. Was it the temperamental choreographer, driven by pride? Her passionate dance partner, consumed by unrequited love? The ambitious rival, hungry for the spotlight? Or the ruthless manager, hiding a sinister plot? Chapter 1. The Curtain Falls. The Theatre Royal, nestled in the heart of St. Mary Mead, glowed with an elegance that belied the village's pastoral simplicity. Its gilded arches and crimson velvet seats drew a crowd far beyond the local gentry, especially on this crisp autumn evening, when the air thrummed with anticipation for Swan Lake. The prima ballerina, Elise Varnier, was the night's star, her name whispered in reverent tones by those clutching their programs. Her performance was nothing short of transcendent, each arabesque a poem, each leap a defiance of gravity. As Odette, she wove a spell of fragile grace, her delicate frame seeming to float above the stage, her dark eyes glistening with the tragedy of the Swan Queen. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in the third row, had come at the insistence of her niece, Joan, a fervent patron of the arts. Joan had promised an evening of rare beauty, and Miss Marple, though more accustomed to the quiet intrigues of village life, found herself captivated. Her keen eyes, framed by spectacles and softened by age, missed nothing. The flicker of envy in a young dancer's glance, the taut posture of the choreographer in the wings, the restless energy of the manager pacing near the stage door. She noted, too, the ardent gaze of Elise's dance partner, a tall Russian whose intensity seemed to burn through the footlights. As the final act reached its crescendo, Elise's transformation into Odile was electrifying. Her pirouettes spun a web of dark enchantment, and when she sank into her final pose, the audience erupted in applause that shook the chandeliers. Miss Marple clapped politely, her mind already sifting through the undercurrents she'd sensed. The curtain fell, heavy and final, and the crowd began to disperse, their chatter a hum of delight. But as Miss Marple gathered her shawl and prepared to meet Joan at the foyer, a disturbance rippled through the theater's backstage. A stagehand's voice, sharp with alarm, carried through the thinning crowd. "She's gone, Miss Varnier. She's not in her dressing room." Whispers spread like wildfire. The manager, a severe woman in a tailored suit, barked orders to the crew, her face a mask of controlled panic. The choreographer, a wiry man with a Gallic air, stormed past, muttering in French. Miss Marple lingered, her curiosity piqued, as Joan approached, her brow furrowed. "Aunt Jane, they're saying Elise has vanished, simply disappeared, like a ghost. Isn't it dreadful?" Joan's voice held the thrill of gossip, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her fingers adjusting the brim of her hat. "Dreadful indeed," she replied softly, her tone carrying the weight of experience. "But people do not vanish, my dear. They are misplaced, or they choose to go. Or perhaps someone ensures they are not found." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived, his notebook in hand and his manner brisk, the theater had taken on a different air, one of suspicion and unease. The stagehands scoured the wings, the wardrobe mistress checked the costume racks, and the dancers huddled in knots, their faces pale beneath their stage makeup. Elise's dressing room, Craddock reported to a small group that included Miss Marple, was oddly pristine. Her mirror was lined with telegrams of admiration, her makeup neatly arranged, but her coat and handbag were missing. No signs of a struggle, no note, no clue, save for the absence of the woman herself. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, listened as Craddock questioned the company's principal figures. Maurice Duval, the choreographer, insisted Elise had been in high spirits, though he admitted to a heated rehearsal dispute earlier that week. Leonid Petrov, the dance partner, stood silent, his jaw tight, offering only that Elise had seemed distracted during the performance. Clara Henshaw, the manager, dismissed the fuss as hysterical nonsense, her sharp eyes darting to the exits. Isabel Crane, the understudy and rival, hovered at the edge of the group, her delicate features pinched with something that might have been fear or satisfaction. As the police cordoned off the dressing room, Miss Marple slipped away to the auditorium, now dim and empty. She sat in her earlier seat, her knitting bag at her side, and let her thoughts drift. She recalled a long-ago incident in St. Mary Mead, when a young girl had disappeared after a church fete, only to be found hiding in a neighbor's attic, driven by a petty slight. This, she sensed, was no such simple matter. The Theatre Royal held secrets, and Elise Varnier's absence was but the first thread in a tapestry of motives and deceits. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. She would unravel it, as she always did, one stitch at a time. Chapter 2. The Suspects Emerge. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, casting delicate patterns across her sitting room. The air carried the faint scent of lavender from a bowl on the mantelpiece, and the ticking of the grandfather clock provided a steady rhythm to her thoughts. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea balanced on a small table beside her, the steam curling upward like a question mark. The St. Mary Mead Gazette lay open on her lap, its front page dominated by a dramatic headline: Ballerina vanishes after triumph at Theatre Royal. Beneath it, a grainy photograph captured Elise Varnier mid-pirouette, her form a blur of elegance, her expression one of serene command. The article speculated wildly: abduction, elopement, nervous collapse, but offered no facts beyond the barest outline of the night's events. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, not in disapproval of the sensationalism, but in recognition of its uselessness. She had learned long ago that truth lay not in headlines, but in the small, overlooked details. A glance exchanged, a word unspoken, a shadow where none should be. Her attendance at the Swan Lake performance had been a rare indulgence, prompted by her niece Joan's enthusiasm, but now it seemed Providence had placed her at the heart of a mystery. Elise Varnier's disappearance was no mere theatrical caprice, and Miss Marple's mind, sharp as the needles in her knitting bag, was already threading together the fragments she had observed. The Theatre Royal, though modest by London standards, was the pride of St. Mary Mead's cultural aspirations. Its stage had hosted Elise Varnier's brilliance, but also, Miss Marple suspected, the darker impulses of those around her. The police, led by the capable but overworked Inspector Craddock, were treating the case as urgent, yet their questions, as reported by Joan over breakfast, seemed to lack focus. "They're interviewing everyone," Joan had said, her eyes wide with excitement. "But no one saw anything. It's as if Elise turned to mist." Miss Marple had smiled gently, remarking that mist, like mystery, often concealed something solid beneath its veil. By noon, Miss Marple decided to visit the theater, ostensibly to retrieve a program she claimed to have dropped. The walk through St. Mary Mead was brisk, the autumn air sharp with the promise of early frost. The village was abuzz with gossip. Mrs. Bantry at the post office had already declared Elise the victim of a foreign spy ring, while Mr. Pye, the florist, insisted she'd run off with a lover. Miss Marple listened politely, her silence encouraging their theories, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the faces she had seen last night. At the Theatre Royal, the atmosphere was one of subdued chaos. The box office was shuttered, but backstage, stagehands moved props with a listless air, their usual banter replaced by whispers. Miss Marple, her gray shawl blending with the shadows, slipped into the green room, where a group of dancers sat huddled over cups of tepid tea. Their faces, stripped of stage makeup, revealed a mix of fatigue and fear. She recognized Isabel Crane, the understudy, her auburn hair pulled into a tight bun, her fingers twisting a handkerchief. Isabel's beauty was striking, yet there was a brittleness to her, as if a single misstep might shatter her composure. "Such a dreadful business," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and sympathetic, as she settled into a chair near the group. Miss Varnier's performance was unforgettable. It seems impossible she could simply vanish. The dancers glanced at one another, uncertain how to respond to this elderly woman with her mild manners and piercing eyes. A young corps dancer, emboldened by Miss Marple's kindly air, spoke up. She was perfect last night, wasn't she? But, well, she wasn't herself before the curtain went up, kept pacing, muttering about something. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of polite curiosity. Something troubling her, perhaps? A disagreement? The dancer hesitated, glancing at Isabel, who stiffened. "Oh, nothing specific," the girl said quickly. "Just nerves, I suppose." Isabel's lips tightened, but she said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. Miss Marple noted the exchange, her mind recalling a village girl who once hid her resentment behind similar silences. She made a mental note to speak with Isabel alone, sensing the understudy's envy was a thread worth tugging. Before she could pursue the matter, Inspector Craddock entered, his notebook in hand and his expression one of determined patience. He was a man in his 40s, with a square jaw and a manner that suggested he respected Miss Marple's insights, even if he occasionally found her methods unorthodox. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a nod. "I might have known you'd be here. Care to share any observations?" "Only that people are rarely as invisible as they seem," she replied, her eyes twinkling. "Have you spoken with the principal figures yet?" Craddock sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Just finished the first round. Maurice Duval, the choreographer, claims he was in the lighting booth during the final act, arguing with the technician about a spotlight. Leonid Petrov, the dance partner, says he was in the wings, watching Elise's solo. Clara Henshaw, the manager, was in her office, going over accounts. And Isabel Crane," he glanced at the young dancer, "says she was in the chorus dressing room, changing after her scene." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers absently smoothing the edge of her shawl. "And their stories hold?" "So far," Craddock said, his tone skeptical. "But no one saw Elise after her final bow. Her dressing room was empty by the time the stage manager checked, 10 minutes after the curtain fell. Her coat and bag are gone, but her costume was left on the chair, neatly folded. It's as if she walked out and evaporated." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Or was made to appear so," she murmured. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, grocer, who once staged a theft to cover a debt, his shop left in calculated disarray. "Might I see the dressing room, Inspector? I've a notion to look for my program." Craddock raised an eyebrow but acquiesced, leading her down a narrow corridor lined with posters of past productions. Elisa's dressing room was small but elegant, its walls adorned with photographs of her in various roles: Giselle, Coppelia, Aurora. The mirror was framed with telegrams and cards, their messages glowing with praise. "Brava, Elise! A star unmatched." A single rose, its petals beginning to wilt, lay on the dressing table, its stem tied with a black ribbon. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, noting the ribbon's unusual choice. "No signs of a struggle," Craddock said, gesturing to the room. "No blood, no overturned furniture, just nothing." Miss Marple stepped closer to the table, her eyes scanning the surface. A powder compact, a lipstick, a pair of earrings, all in place, as if Elise had intended to return. But beneath the table, half hidden by a fallen scarf, was a crumpled program. Miss Marple bent to retrieve it, her movements slow but deliberate. The program was from last night's performance, and Elise's name was circled in red ink, the pen strokes heavy and uneven. She tucked it into her bag, saying nothing, but her mind was alight with possibilities. The mark was not careless. It was deliberate, almost angry. As they left the dressing room, Miss Marple caught sight of Clara Henshaw in the corridor, her severe black dress and clipped stride giving her the air of a headmistress. Clara's eyes met Miss Marple's for a moment, and there was a flicker of something, defiance, perhaps, or unease, before she turned away, barking orders to a stagehand. Miss Marple made another mental note. Clara's efficiency was admirable, but it reminded her of a village matron who once hid a scandal behind a facade of impeccable order. Craddock escorted Miss Marple back to the green room, where Maurice Duval now sat, his thin frame hunched over a cigarette. His face, lined with the strain of genius, was pale, and his fingers trembled slightly as he exhaled a cloud of smoke. "This is a disaster," he muttered, his French accent sharp. "Elise was my muse, my creation. Without her, the company is nothing." Miss Marple sat opposite him, her expression one of gentle concern. "She was extraordinary," she agreed. "But such talent often breeds complications, does it not? Rivalries, perhaps, or misunderstandings." Maurice's eyes narrowed, but he waved a hand dismissively. "Elise was difficult, yes. She questioned my vision, wanted to cling to the old ballets, but she would never leave without a word. She lived for the stage." Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling a village artist whose pride in his work masked a deeper insecurity. Maurice's passion for his craft was evident, but was it enough to drive him to desperation? She thanked him and moved on, her thoughts turning to Leonid Petrov. She found the Russian dancer in the rehearsal studio, his broad shoulders glistening with sweat as he practiced a series of jetés. His movements were powerful, almost violent, and Miss Marple sensed a man wrestling with more than just technique. She waited until he paused, then approached, her voice soft but clear. "Mr. Petrov, I was so struck by your performance last night. You and Miss Varnier were a perfect pair." Leonid's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of pain. "Elise was the heart of it," he said, his voice low and accented. "I was only her shadow." Miss Marple smiled, her tone encouraging. "A shadow can be vital, Mr. Petrov, but it must be difficult, dancing so closely with someone so luminous." He hesitated, then nodded. She was everything. But she did not see me, not as I saw her. His hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the raw emotion in his voice, reminiscent of a young man in St. Mary Mead who once broke a window in a fit of unrequited love. Before she could press further, Isabel Crane entered the studio, her presence like a sudden chill. She glanced at Leonid, then at Miss Marple, her smile tight. "They're saying Elise ran off," she said, her voice light but edged with venom. She always did love the drama. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert. "Perhaps," she said, "but drama on stage is one thing. Off stage, it often hides something quite different." As she left the theater, Miss Marple's thoughts were a tangle of impressions. Maurice's pride, Leonid's passion, Clara's control, Isabel's envy. Each was a thread in the mystery of Elise's disappearance. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead's scandal, where a missing necklace had been found in the most unlikely place, revealed by a single careless word. Elise Varnier was no necklace, but Miss Marple knew that the truth, like all precious things, would surface in time. She walked home, her steps light, her mind already planning her next visit to the Theatre Royal. Chapter 3. A Glimpse. Backstage. The afternoon light slanted through the high windows of the Theatre Royal, casting long shadows across the backstage corridors. Miss Jane Marple, her gray shawl draped neatly over her shoulders, moved with the quiet purpose of a woman accustomed to going unnoticed. She had returned to the theater under the guise of searching for a mislaid glove, a pretext as flimsy as the lace in her handbag, but sufficient to grant her access. The police had cordoned off Elise Varnier's dressing room, but the rest of the theater hummed with subdued activity. Stagehands shifting scenery, dancers stretching in the wings, and the faint strains of a piano, echoing from a rehearsal room. The air smelled of rosin and old velvet, a scent Miss Marple found oddly comforting, reminiscent of the church hall during St. Mary Mead's amateur theatricals. Her true purpose was to observe, to let the theater reveal its secrets, in the way a village might betray its scandals through a careless glance or an unguarded word. She had learned long ago that people were most truthful when they thought themselves unseen, and a backstage, with its labyrinth of props and costumes, was a place ripe for such truths. As she wandered, her footsteps soft on the worn floorboards, she noted the tension that lingered like a sour note in the air. The dancers moved with a wariness that spoke of more than fatigue, and the crew exchanged glances that hinted at unspoken suspicions. Miss Marple paused near a rack of feathered headdresses, her fingers brushing the fabric of her glove as if testing its texture. Her eyes, however, were fixed on a small table cluttered with props, a tarnished candelabra, a velvet cloak, a pair of cracked ballet slippers. Beneath the table, almost hidden by a fold of cloth, lay a torn program from Swan Lake. She bent to retrieve it, her movements deliberate, and saw that it was not the same program she had found in Elise's dressing room. This one bore a different mark, a single word, traitor, scrawled in black ink across Elise's photograph. The handwriting was jagged, as if written in haste or anger, and Miss Marple tucked the program into her bag beside the other, her mind already turning over its implications. In St. Mary Mead, she had once found a similar note, slipped into a hymn book that had unraveled a tale of betrayal. Words, she knew, were rarely careless. A sudden burst of voices drew her attention to the wings, where Maurice Duval, the choreographer, stood berating Isabel Crane, His thin frame was taut with frustration, his hands slicing the air as he spoke in rapid French, punctuated by sharp English phrases. "You must feel the music, Isabel. You lack her fire, her soul." Isabel's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes burned with a resentment that Miss Marple recognized at once. It was the same look she had seen in a village girl who envied another's engagement, a look that promised trouble if left unchecked. Miss Marple stepped closer, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, and caught Isabel's murmured reply. "Perhaps if I had her rolls, I'd find my fire." Maurice's response was a dismissive snort, but as he turned away, Miss Marple noted the tremor in his hands, the same she had seen the day before. Was it merely the strain of genius, or something deeper? A fear, perhaps, of exposure. She moved on, her steps taking her toward the stage door, where a young stagehand, a lanky boy with a shock of red hair, was sweeping the floor. He glanced up as she approached, his freckled face brightening at her kindly smile. "Lost something, ma'am?" he asked, leaning on his broom. "My glove, I fear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and apologetic. "But I'm more curious about poor Miss Varnier. Such a shock for you all. Did you see her after the performance?" The boy hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Not after, no. But I saw her before, in the corridor near the props room. She looked upset, like. Kept looking over her shoulder, as if someone was following her." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained gentle. "Following her? How curious. Did you see anyone else?" The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. But it was odd, you know. She was always so calm, like a queen. Never saw her rattled before." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind filing away the detail. She recalled a saint. Mary Mead, widow, who had once fled a garden party, convinced she was being watched, only to discover her fears were rooted in a guilty secret. Was Elise's unease a sign of danger, or had she herself been hiding something? Her wanderings took her next to the orchestra pit, where a pianist was practicing scales, the notes sharp and repetitive. Nearby, a bulletin board was pinned with notices, rehearsal schedules, costume fittings, a stern memo about tardiness. Tucked among them was a photograph of Elise and Leonid Petrov in a pas de deux, their bodies arched in perfect harmony. Someone had drawn a faint line through Elise's face, so subtle it might have been an accident. But Miss Marple's eyes missed nothing. She thought of a village school teacher who had once defaced a rival's portrait in a fit of spite, and wondered whose hand had wielded this particular pen. As she turned from the board, she nearly collided with Clara Henshaw, the company manager, who emerged from a side door with a clipboard in hand. Clara's face was a study in control, her dark hair pulled back severely, her suit as crisp as her tone. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice polite but edged with impatience. "Still looking for that glove?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming. "But I find myself distracted by this dreadful affair. Miss Varnier's absence must be a terrible strain on the company." Clara's lips twitched, as if suppressing a retort. "It's a nuisance, certainly. Elise was our star, but stars have a way of burning out. She'll turn up, no doubt, with some dramatic excuse." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes mild but searching. "You think she left of her own accord, then?" Clara shrugged, her fingers tightening on the clipboard. "She's a performer. They thrive on attention, even the negative sort. I've seen it before, dancers staging their own dramas to keep the spotlight." The words were delivered with a practiced ease, but Miss Marple detected a note of calculation, as if Clara were reciting a script. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper, who had once deflected suspicion with similar nonchalance, only to be caught in a web of her own lies. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. But it's curious, isn't it, how her coat and bag vanished with her, almost as if someone wished it to look like a departure. Clara's eyes flickered, but she recovered quickly, her smile thin. The police will sort it out, I'm sure. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a company to manage. She strode off, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning over the encounter. Clara's efficiency was a shield, but shields often hid vulnerabilities. She made her way to the auditorium, where the empty seats stretched out like silent witnesses. Settling into a chair in the third row, she opened her bag and examined the torn program, its accusing word, traitor, staring up at her. She placed it beside the program from Elise's dressing room, with its red circled name, and considered the contrast. One was an act of rage, the other of intent. Were they the work of the same hand, or did the theater harbor multiple resentments? As she sat, the faint creak of a door drew her attention to the back of the auditorium. A figure slipped out, too quickly for her to identify, but the movement was furtive, deliberate. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. In St. Mary Mead, she had once caught a poacher by noting his habit of avoiding the main path. Here, too, someone was avoiding scrutiny, and she intended to find out who. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and made her way to the exit, her steps unhurried but purposeful. The Theatre Royal was a stage, not just for ballet, but for human nature, with all its passions and deceits. Elise Varnier's disappearance was the opening act, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom and unerring eye, was determined to see the drama through to its final curtain. Chapter 4. The Choreographer's Secret. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of the village's thatched cottages and cobblestone lanes. Miss Jane Marple sat in her garden, a tray of tea and biscuits on the wicker table before her, the scent of roses mingling with the crisp air. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, for her mind was too occupied with the puzzle of Elise Varnier's disappearance to focus on the familiar rhythm of needles. The torn program with its scrawled traitor and the red-circled name from Elise's dressing room lay on the table, carefully smoothed out beside her teacup. They were clues, yes, but clues to what? A personal grudge, a professional betrayal, or something more sinister? Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to a long-ago incident in the village, where a farmer's angry note had exposed a feud over stolen livestock. Words, she knew, could be as revealing as fingerprints. She had decided to invite Maurice Duval, the choreographer, for tea. His temperamental nature and evident distress at the theater suggested a man with something to hide, or at least something to say. A direct approach, Miss Marple knew, would only make him bristle, but a cup of tea in the quiet of her cottage might loosen his guard. She had sent a note via her maid, Cherry, inviting him to discuss the ballet's future, a pretext that flattered his artistic pride. As she waited, she sipped her tea, her eyes scanning the garden path for his arrival. Maurice appeared promptly at 4, his wiry frame clad in a black coat that seemed too large for him, his dark hair slicked back with an air of theatrical flourish. His face, though handsome in a sharp, Gallic way, was drawn, and his fingers fidgeted with a cigarette he did not light. "Miss Marple," he said, his accent clipping the words. "This is most kind, but I fear I am poor company today. This catastrophe with Elise has undone me." Miss Marple smiled, her expression one of gentle sympathy, and gestured to a chair. "Please, Mr. Duval, do sit. A cup of tea can work wonders, even in the darkest moments. I was so struck by your choreography last night. So bold, so modern. Elise must have been a delight to work with." Maurice's eyes softened at the compliment, though a shadow lingered in them. He accepted the tea, his movements precise, almost balletic. "She was extraordinary," he said, his voice low. "A dancer who could make my visions live, but she was, how do you say, obstinate. She clung to the old ways, the classical roles. She fought me on my new piece, L'Ombre, said it was too avant-garde, too risky." Miss Marple nodded, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Artists often clash over vision, don't they? I recall a painter in our village who nearly came to blows with his patron over a portrait style. But such passion can inspire greatness, or trouble." Maurice's lips twitched, as if unsure whether to smile or frown. "Trouble, yes. Elise was the heart of the company, but she could be infuriating. She wanted control, always questioning my steps, my tempos. Yet without her, L'Ombre is nothing." He paused, his fingers tightening around the teacup. "You think I had something to do with her disappearance, don't you?" Miss Marple's eyes widened, her expression one of innocent surprise. "Goodness, Mr. Duval, I think nothing of the sort. I only wonder what might have driven her away, or who. You knew her well, I imagine. Was there anyone she feared or distrusted?" Maurice hesitated, his gaze drifting to the roses beyond the garden gate. "She was private, you know, kept her thoughts close, but lately she was distracted. She mentioned something about a letter, something that upset her. I thought it was nerves, the pressure of the season. I told her to focus on the dance, to let the rest go." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes, like a candle guttering in a draught. "A letter?" she prompted gently, her tone as soft as the breeze. "Did she say who sent it?" Maurice shook his head, his fingers finally lighting the cigarette, though he did not inhale. "Number." She crumpled it and threw it into her dressing-room bin. "I saw it there, but I didn't read it. I should have, perhaps." He exhaled sharply, the smoke curling upward like a confession. "If I had, maybe I could have stopped. Whatever happened." Miss Marple's mind quickened, though her face remained serene. A letter, discarded but significant enough to unsettle Elise. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Spinster, who had once received an anonymous note, its contents driving her to tears. Such things were rarely trivial. "You mustn't blame yourself," she said kindly. "But it's curious, isn't it? How small things, a letter, a word, can change everything." Maurice nodded, his expression distant. "She was my muse, Miss Marple. Without her, the company will falter. Clara, Miss Henshaw, talks of replacing her with Isabel, but Isabel lacks Elise's depth, her fire. She's a mimic, not a creator." Miss Marple noted the bitterness in his tone, the way his eyes darkened at Isabel's name. "Miss Crane is young," she said, her voice neutral. "Perhaps she'll grow into her roles, but it must be difficult, working with someone so eager to step into Elise's shoes." Maurice's jaw tightened, and he stubbed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "Isabel is ambitious, too ambitious. She hovers like a vulture, waiting for her chance. But Elise was no fool. She saw through her. They argued, a week ago. I heard them in the rehearsal room, shouting about roles, about fairness. Isabel stormed out, her face red as fire. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though she kept her tone light. An argument? How distressing. But dancers are passionate, aren't they? I've seen it in our village plays. Tempers flare, but they often cool just as quickly. Perhaps, Maurice said, but his voice lacked conviction. He rose, his movements abrupt. I must return to the theater. Rehearsals cannot stop, even now. Thank you for the tea, Miss Marple. You are kinder than most. As he left, his coat flapping like a raven's wings, Miss Marple watched him go, her mind piecing together the fragments of their conversation. Maurice's pride in his work was evident, but so was his unease. The mention of a letter, crumpled and discarded, was a thread she could not ignore. And his disdain for Isabel suggested a rivalry that might run deeper than professional jealousy. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Gardner, who had once sabotaged a rival's roses out of spite, and wondered if Maurice's passion for his art could have driven him to a darker act. She rose, clearing the tea tray with her usual care, and returned to the sitting room. The programs lay on the table, their accusing marks. Red ink, black scrawl, staring up at her like eyes. She considered the letter Maurice had mentioned. If it still existed, it might hold the key to Elise's state of mind. The theater's bins would have been emptied by now, but Miss Marple knew that people often overlooked the obvious. In St. Mary Mead, she had once found a vital clue in a church dustbin, mistaken for rubbish by all but her. She decided to return to the theater that evening, when the bustle of the day had quieted. Under the pretense of inquiring about a lost scarf, her glove excuse was wearing thin, she would search the dressing room area again. The police, she knew, were thorough, but their focus was on the grand gestures of crime. Blood, fingerprints, broken locks. Miss Marple's interest lay in the smaller things, the traces left by human nature. As she prepared to leave, Cherry appeared, her apron dusted with flour from baking. "Off to the theater again, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone teasing but fond. "You'll solve this before the police, I reckon." Miss Marple smiled, adjusting her hat in the hall mirror. "I'm only an old woman with too much curiosity, Cherry, but curiosity, like a good recipe, can uncover the most surprising things." The evening air was cool as she made her way to the Theatre Royal, her steps steady despite the uneven cobbles. The theater loomed ahead, its lights dimmed but not extinguished, a beacon of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Maurice's words echoed in her mind. His muse, his vision, his guilt. She thought of Elise, alone in her dressing room, crumpling a letter that had shaken her calm. Whatever that letter contained, Miss Marple was determined to find its echo, for in its words, she suspected, lay the truth of the vanished ballerina. Chapter 5. The Partner's Passion. The evening sky over St. Mary Mead was a tapestry of deepening blue, streaked with threads of crimson as the sun dipped below the horizon. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl tucked snugly against the evening chill, sat in the cozy confines of the Blue Boar Inn, a quaint establishment whose oak beams and crackling fire offered a stark contrast to the Theatre Royal's gilded elegance. She had chosen the inn for her next inquiry, knowing that Leonid Petrov, Elise Varnier's dance partner, frequented its quiet corner after rehearsals. The inn's warmth and the promise of a glass of sherry, she hoped, would loosen the Russian's guarded tongue, much as tea had softened Maurice Duval's defenses. Miss Marple settled at a small table near the hearth, her knitting bag at her side, its contents a comforting pretext for her presence. The inn was half empty, its patrons a mix of local farmers and theater folk seeking respite from the day's turmoil. Leonid arrived promptly, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his dark hair disheveled from the wind. His face, handsome in a brooding Slavic way, carried the weight of sleepless nights, and his eyes, when they met hers, held a storm of emotions. Grief, perhaps, or something sharper. "Mr. Petrov," Miss Marple greeted, her voice as gentle as the firelight. "How kind of you to join an old woman for a chat. I was so moved by your performance in Swan Lake. You and Miss Varnier were a vision." Leonid eased into the chair opposite, his movements heavy, as if the act of sitting required effort. He accepted the sherry she offered, his fingers wrapping around the glass with a grip that suggested restraint. "Thank you," he said, his accent thick, his voice low. "Elise." She made it easy. She was the soul of the dance. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but watchful. She was extraordinary indeed. It must be a great loss, not only to the company but to you, who danced so closely with her. Such partnerships are rare, I imagine. Leonid's gaze dropped to the glass, his thumb tracing its rim. Rare, yes. She was not just a dancer. She was everything. The stage came alive with her. I was only her shadow, following her light. His words carried a reverence that bordered on worship, and Miss Marple noted the intensity in his tone, reminiscent of a young man in St. Mary Mead who had once carved a girl's initials into a tree, his love as fervent as it was doomed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice a soothing murmur. "It sounds as though you cared for her deeply. That must make her absence all the more painful. Did she ever confide in you? Perhaps about something troubling her?" Leonid's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might retreat into silence. But the sherry, or perhaps her gentle demeanor, seemed to unlock something within him. "She did not confide," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "Elise was private, like a locked room. But I saw things. She was restless these last weeks. She would stop mid-rehearsal, stare at nothing, as if hearing a voice I could not hear. I asked her once, after a late practice, if something was wrong. She only smiled, said it was the strain of the season. But her smile, it was not real." Miss Marple's fingers paused on her knitting, though she had not yet begun. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead widow, who had worn such a smile, hiding a secret that had nearly destroyed her. "A false smile can hide many things," she said softly. "Did you ever see her with anyone who might have caused her distress? A letter, perhaps, or an unexpected visitor?" Leonid's eyes flicked to hers, sharp and wary, as if she had struck too close to a truth. "A letter, yes," he said slowly. "I saw her reading one, maybe 2 weeks ago, in the rehearsal room. She folded it quickly when I approached, but her hands were shaking. I thought, perhaps it was from a lover, someone from her past. She never spoke of such things, but I felt it, you know? A man knows when a woman's heart is elsewhere." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of quiet sympathy. "Love can be a heavy burden, Mr. Petrov. It can inspire, but it can also wound. Were you close to her in that way?" His face darkened, and he drained his sherry in one swift motion, the glass clinking sharply against the table. "I loved her," he said, the words raw, as if torn from him. "I never told her, not in words, but every lift, Every step we danced. It was my confession. She did not see me, not as I saw her. She danced for art, for the audience, not for me. His hands clenched, the knuckles whitening, and Miss Marple saw in his tension the echo of a St. Mary Mead laborer who had once shattered a bottle in a fit of unrequited passion. She nodded, her voice gentle but probing. It must have been difficult, loving someone so unattainable. Did it ever anger you, perhaps, that she did not return? Your feelings? Leonid's eyes flashed, but he shook his head fiercely. Never. I would have died for her. When she vanished, I thought perhaps she had run from something, someone. Not me. I would never harm her. His voice broke, and he looked away, his broad shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from her gaze. Miss Marple let the silence settle, her mind sifting through his words. His love was genuine, she felt, but love could twist into darker shapes, jealousy, possession, despair. She recalled the program with its angry traitor scrawl and wondered if Leonid's passion had ever spilled into rage. Yet his grief seemed too raw, too unguarded to be entirely feigned. She changed tack, her tone lightening. You must know the company well, Mr. Petrov. Was there anyone who might have wished Elise ill? A rival, perhaps? Or someone with a grievance? Leonid hesitated, his fingers tapping the empty glass. Isabel, maybe, he said at last. She wanted Elise's roles, her spotlight. They fought, not loudly, but you could feel it. Cold, like a winter wind. And Maurice, he pushed Elise hard, too hard sometimes. He wanted her to be his creation, not her own. But Clara, she's the one who controls everything. The schedules, the money, the contracts. If anyone had power over Elise, it was her. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. Miss Henshaw does seem a formidable woman, she said, but control can be a mask, can't it? In our village, I knew a woman who ruled her household with an iron hand, yet hid her own fears behind it. Leonid nodded, his gaze distant. Clara is like that, always watching, always planning. Elise once said she felt like a puppet under Clara's strings. I thought it was a joke, but now... He trailed off, his hands clenching again. Miss Marple thanked him, her voice warm with gratitude, and watched as he left the inn, his tall figure disappearing into the dusk. She sat for a moment longer, her thoughts turning over his words like pebbles in a stream. The letter, mentioned again, was a persistent thread, its contents still a mystery. Leonid's love, so fiercely declared, was another, its intensity both a motive and a shield. And Clara's name, cropping up once more, carried a weight she could not ignore. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft by tracing a single word to its source. Here, too, she sensed that words, written, spoken, or unspoken, would lead her to Elise. As she gathered her knitting and prepared to leave, the innkeeper approached, his ruddy face creased with concern. Terrible business, this ballerina vanishing, he said. Heard anything, Miss Marple? You've a knack for these things. She smiled, adjusting her shawl. Only whispers, Mr. Jenkins. But whispers, like footsteps, can lead you somewhere if you listen closely. With that, she stepped into the evening, her mind already planning her next move. The Theatre Royal awaited, and with it, the secrets of a vanished ballerina. Chapter 6. The Manager's Motive. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a soft, secretive veil, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the Theatre Royal. Her black umbrella held more for propriety than necessity, tapped lightly against the ground, a counterpoint to her measured steps. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of wet leaves and wood smoke, and Miss Marple's thoughts were as layered as the mist itself, turning over the threads of Elise Varnier's disappearance. Leonide's raw confession of love, Maurice's guarded guilt, and the persistent shadow of that crumpled letter all pointed to a web of motives. But it was Clara Henshaw, the company manager, who now occupied her mind. Clara's brisk dismissal of Elise's absence, coupled with Leonide's remark about her control, suggested a woman who wielded power with precision, and perhaps with purpose. Miss Marple had arranged to meet Clara at the theater, using the pretext of discussing a potential donation to the company, a ruse that appealed to Clara's practical nature. The Theatre Royale's foyer was quiet when she arrived, its chandeliers dimmed, the posters of Swan Lake now tinged with an air of melancholy. A young usher directed her to Clara's office, a small, impeccably organized room tucked behind the box office. The walls were lined with schedules, budgets, and framed reviews, each pinned with military precision. Clara sat behind a desk cluttered with ledgers, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun, her tailored suit as crisp as her demeanor. She rose as Miss Marple entered, her smile polite but thin, like a sheet of ice over a frozen pond. "Miss Marple," Clara said, her voice smooth but clipped. "How generous of you to consider supporting our little company, though I fear we're rather overshadowed by this business with Elise." Miss Marple settled into a chair, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. "It's a dreadful affair," she said, her tone soft with sympathy. "Such a loss for the theater. You must be under tremendous strain, managing everything in her absence." Clara's lips twitched, as if suppressing a sigh. "It's my job to keep things running, no matter the circumstances. Dancers come and go, some more dramatically than others. Elise was our star, of course, but we'll manage. Isabel Crane is ready to step up, and the season must go on." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes mild but alert, noting the ease with which Clara shifted focus to Isabel. "Miss Crane is talented, I'm sure," she said, "but replacing someone like Elise must be a challenge. I imagine you knew her plans, her ambitions, better than most. Did she ever hint at leaving?" Clara's fingers paused on a pen, her gaze sharpening for a fraction of a second before she leaned back, her expression composed. Elise was a professional. She lived for the stage. If she had plans to leave, she kept them to herself. Frankly, I think she staged this disappearance for attention. She was always theatrical. The words were delivered with a practiced nonchalance, but Miss Marple detected a faint edge, like the crack of a twig in a silent wood. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead, shopkeeper, who had once dismissed a theft with similar detachment, only to be found hoarding the stolen goods. "Theatrical," Miss Marple repeated, her voice thoughtful. "An interesting choice of words. In our village we had a woman who vanished after a quarrel, only to return when the fuss had served her purpose. But Elise, her coat and bag were gone, weren't they? That suggests something more deliberate." Clara's eyes narrowed, but she shrugged, her fingers resuming their restless dance with the pen. "Perhaps she planned a holiday and didn't bother to inform us. Dancers can be impulsive, or perhaps someone helped her leave. Either way, the police are handling it, and I have a company to run." Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle curiosity. "Of course, you're terribly busy. I understand you manage not just the dancers, but the company's future. its contracts, its reputation. I heard a whisper that the grand ballet troupe has been circling, hoping to poach talent. That must be a worry. Clara's hand stilled, and for a moment her composure slipped, revealing a flicker of unease. "The grand ballet troupe is no concern of mine," she said, her voice a shade too sharp. "They're vultures, always sniffing around, but we're stronger than they think. Elise was loyal. She'd never have gone to them." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her smile remained serene. "Loyalty is a fine thing," she said, "but ambition can test it, can't it? In our village, I knew a man who swore allegiance to his employer, only to sell secrets for a better offer. People can surprise you." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, and she rose, as if to signal the end of the conversation. "I'm sure they can, Miss Marple, but I've no time for surprises. If you'll excuse me, I have a meeting with the board." She gestured toward the door, her movements brisk but controlled. Miss Marple rose, her manner unruffled. "Of course, my dear. I'll leave you to your work. But if you do think of anything, about Elise, or perhaps a letter she received, do let me know. Small things can matter so much." Clara's eyes flicked to hers, searching, but she only nodded curtly. As Miss Marple left the office, she felt the weight of Clara's gaze on her back, like a hand hesitating to strike. The manager's cool efficiency was a fortress, but fortresses often hid cracks, and Miss Marple was adept at finding them. She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Matron, who had ruled her charity committee with an iron hand, only to be undone by a single misplaced receipt. Clara's dismissal of Elise's disappearance felt too polished, too rehearsed, and her reaction to the grand ballet troupe had been a telltale flinch. As she stepped into the theater's corridor, Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the bulletin board she had noticed the previous day. Among the schedules and notices, a new edition caught her attention, a clipping from a London arts magazine praising the grand ballet troupe's recent acquisition of a rising star. The article was vague, but a handwritten note in the margin, in a neat, precise script, read, "They'll regret this." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but its tone echoed the traitor scrawl from the program. Miss Marple made a mental note, her mind turning over the possibility that Clara, with her access to contracts and connections, might know more about the rival company than she admitted. She continued her wanderings, her steps taking her to the props room, a dimly lit space cluttered with gilded chairs, painted backdrops, and a rack of costumes that shimmered like ghosts. A young seamstress was mending a torn tutu, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm and disarming. "Such beautiful work," she said, gesturing to the delicate stitches. "You must see so much of what happens here, tucked away among the costumes." The seamstress, a girl with wide eyes and a nervous smile, blushed. "Oh, I just keep my head down, ma'am, but it's been awful since Miss Varnier disappeared. Everyone's on edge." "I can imagine," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic. "Did you ever see Miss Varnier with Miss Henshaw, perhaps discussing business? They must have worked closely together." The girl hesitated, her needle pausing. "Not often, ma'am. Miss Henshaw's always in her office, and Miss Varnier kept to herself. But I did overhear them once, last week, in the corridor. Miss Varnier was upset, saying something about a promise not kept. Miss Henshaw told her to be patient, that things would work out. It didn't sound friendly." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind was alert. "How curious," she said. "And did you see anything else? Perhaps a letter, or a visitor who seemed out of place?" The seamstress shook her head. "No letters, ma'am, but there was a man, a week or so ago, hanging about the stage door. Not one of our crew. He had a fancy coat like a city gentleman. I thought he was waiting for Miss Varnier, but she ignored him when she left." Miss Marple thanked the girl, her thoughts racing. A promise not kept, a mysterious man, and Clara's guarded reaction to the grand ballet troupe. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, though its shape remained elusive. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead merchant, who had betrayed a partner for profit, his calm facade hiding a ruthless ambition. Was Clara's efficiency a mask for a similar betrayal? As she left the props room, Miss Marple's eyes fell on a small waste bin near the door, overflowing with scraps of fabric and paper. On a whim, she sifted through it, her gloved fingers careful but quick. Buried beneath a torn ticket stub was a fragment of an envelope, its edge singed as if someone had tried to burn it. The address was illegible, but a faint, embossed logo caught her eye. A stylized swan, the emblem of the grand ballet troupe. She slipped it into her handbag, her heart quickening. The theater was a stage for more than ballet, and Clara Henshaw, with her iron grip on its strings, was at its center. Miss Marple stepped into the foyer, her umbrella tapping softly as she prepared to return home. The mist had lifted, but the mystery of Elise Varnier remained, its threads tightening around the Theatre Royal. Clara's motive, she sensed, lay not in passion but in calculation, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover its roots. Chapter 7. The Rival's Ambition. The pale light of a November morning filtered through the leaded windows of the St. Mary Mead tea-room, where Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner table, her hands folded neatly over her handbag. The tea-room, with its chintz curtains and polished silver teapots, was a haven of village gentility, a place where gossip flowed as freely as the tea. Miss Marple had chosen it for her meeting with Isabel Crane, the young dancer whose envy of Elise Varnier had been whispered about in the Theatre Royal's wings. A direct summons to her cottage might have alarmed the girl, but an invitation to tea, framed as a chance to discuss her promising career, was an offer few aspiring ballerinas could resist. Miss Marple's mild demeanor and reputation as a kindly, if curious, old lady made her an unlikely threat, and she knew how to use that to her advantage. The tea-room was quietly busy, its tables occupied by villagers exchanging news over scones and jam. Miss Marple sipped her Earl Grey, her eyes drifting to the window, where the village green lay dusted with frost. Her thoughts, however, were on the fragments she had gathered, the scrawled traitor on the program, the singed envelope with the grand ballet troupe's logo, and the undercurrents of tension surrounding Clara, Maurice, and Leonide. Isabel, with her youth and ambition, was the final piece of the puzzle's immediate frame, and Miss Marple was eager to test her mettle. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft by listening to a young woman's unguarded complaints. Here, too, she hoped a casual chat might reveal more than Isabel intended. Isabel arrived promptly, her auburn hair swept into a loose bun, her coat a shade too elegant for a dancer's salary. Her face, delicate and sharp-featured, carried a guarded brightness, as if she were perpetually auditioning for an unseen audience. She sat opposite Miss Marple, her movements graceful but tense, like a spring wound too tightly. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice light but practiced, This is so kind of you. I don't often get invited to tea." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes crinkling with warmth. "My dear, it's a pleasure to meet a young talent like yourself. I was so impressed by the company's performance, though, of course, poor Miss Varnier's absence casts a shadow. You must feel it keenly, being so close to her in the company." Isabel's smile flickered, and she reached for her teacup, her fingers lingering on the handle. "It's awful, isn't it? Elise was... well, she was Elise, the star. We're all a bit lost without her." Her tone was sympathetic, but Miss Marple caught the faint edge of satisfaction, like a note struck slightly off-key. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as she poured more tea. "It must be difficult, stepping into such a void. I understand you're her understudy, a great opportunity, but a heavy burden, too." Isabel's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded, her expression carefully composed. "It is. I've worked hard, you know, years of training, always in the background. Elise got every lead role, every spotlight. It's not that I wasn't happy for her, she deserved it, but it's hard to wait your turn forever." Her voice tightened, and she sipped her tea quickly, as if to cover the slip. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression one of gentle understanding. "Of course, my dear. In our village, I knew a young seamstress who felt much the same, always stitching for others' glory. It can wear on one, can't it? Did you and Elise ever clash over such things?" Isabel's fingers tightened on the cup, and for a moment her composure wavered, revealing a flash of resentment. "Clash? No, not really. We were professionals. But, well, she could be cold, you know? Always the queen, looking down on the rest of us. A week ago, we had words in the rehearsal room. She said I wasn't ready for her roles, that I lacked her depth, as if I couldn't learn." Her voice rose, then softened abruptly, as if she'd caught herself. "It was nothing, really, just dancers' tempers." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes soft but piercing. "Tempers do flare," she said. "I recall a village girl who argued with her rival over a flower show prize. Harsh words, but they passed. Though with Elise gone, you must be preparing to take her place. That must feel bittersweet." Isabel's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Bittersweet, yes. I'm ready, though. Maurice says I have potential, and Clara's pushing for me to lead in l'ombre. It's my chance to prove myself." Her tone was eager, almost defiant, and Miss Marple noted the hunger in it, like a St. Mary Mead baker who had sabotaged a rival's bread to win a contest. "Miss Henshaw seems a formidable ally," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "She must value your talent. Did she and Elise get along, do you think? Managers and stars can have such complicated relationships." Isabel hesitated, her fingers twisting a napkin. "Clara was always professional, but I think Elise frustrated her. Elise wanted things her way, schedules, costumes, even the choreography. Clara didn't like being challenged. I overheard them once, in Clara's office, talking about some contract. Elise sounded angry, said something about not being for sale. Clara just laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, though her expression remained serene. "How curious," she said. "Contracts can be such delicate matters. In our village, a farmer once fell out with his landlord over a lease, and it caused quite a stir. Did you ever see Elise with anyone outside the company, perhaps someone connected to her work?" Isabel shook her head, but her hesitation suggested a memory. "Not really, though. There was a man, once, outside the theater. I saw him talking to Elise after a rehearsal, maybe 10 days ago. He looked important, like he was from London. Elise brushed him off, but she seemed shaken afterward. I didn't think much of it. She was always getting attention. Miss Marple's mind quickened, recalling the seamstress's mention of a city gentleman at the stage door. A man from London, she mused, her tone thoughtful. Perhaps a critic or a patron. The theater attracts such types, doesn't it? Isabel shrugged, her interest waning. I suppose, but Elise didn't need patrons. She had the world at her feet. The bitterness in her voice was subtle, but Miss Marple caught it, like a thorn hidden in silk. As the conversation drifted to lighter topics, the tea room's scones, the chill of the season, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the fragments she had gathered. Isabel's envy was palpable, her ambition a sharp blade, but her alibi for the night of Elise's disappearance had been confirmed by a stagehand. She had been in the chorus dressing room, changing after her scene. Yet alibis, Miss Marple knew, could be as deceptive as smiles. She thought of a saint. Mary Mead girl, who had claimed to be at a dance while plotting a theft, her absence unnoticed in the crowd. As Isabel rose to leave, her coat swishing with a dancer's grace, Miss Marple thanked her warmly. "You've been so kind to humor an old woman's curiosity," she said. "I do hope we'll see you shine on the stage soon." Isabel's smile was brighter now, but it held a trace of calculation. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I intend to." She left, her steps light but purposeful, and Miss Marple watched her go, her mind sifting through the encounter. Alone with her tea, Miss Marple considered the pattern forming. A letter that unsettled Elise, a mysterious man from London, and now Isabel's barely concealed resentment. The mention of a contract dispute between Elise and Clara echoed the singed envelope with the Grand Ballet Troupe's logo, and Miss Marple wondered if Isabel's ambition had been stoked by promises, perhaps from Clara, or from the rival company itself. In St. Mary Mead, she had once uncovered a betrayal by tracing a single lie to its source. Here, too, she sensed that ambition, like love or pride, could twist into something darker. She finished her tea, her eyes lingering on the frost-rimmed window. The tea room's warmth was a comfort, but the mystery of Elise Varnier was a cold thread, leading her back to the Theatre Royal. Isabel's ambition was a piece of the puzzle, but its edges did not yet fit. Miss Marple gathered her handbag, her resolve as firm as the cobblestones outside. The truth, she knew, was waiting, hidden in the shadows of the stage. Chapter 8. A clue in the shadows. The Theatre Royal stood quiet under the gray November sky, its ornate facade muted by the gathering dusk. Miss Jane Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, approached with the unhurried gait of a woman accustomed to blending into the background. Her excuse for this visit was a vague inquiry about a lost brooch, but her true purpose was to probe deeper into the shadows of Elise Varnier's disappearance. The fragments she had gathered, the scrawled "traitor," the singed envelope with the Grand Ballet Troupe's logo, the whispers of ambition and betrayal, pointed to a truth hidden not in the spotlight, but in the theater's quieter corners. Miss Marple knew that secrets, like dust, settled in overlooked places, and she was determined to sweep them into the light. The foyer was deserted, its chandeliers casting a faint glow over the marble floor. The silence was broken only by the distant thud of a prop being moved backstage, a reminder that the theater, despite its loss, pulsed with life. Miss Marple made her way to the auditorium, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. She settled into a seat in the stalls, her knitting bag at her side, and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The stage loomed before her, its heavy curtains drawn, but the wings were alive with faint movements, stagehands perhaps, or dancers lingering after rehearsal. She opened her bag, her fingers brushing the programs and the envelope fragment, their presence a quiet reassurance that she was on the right path. As she sat, her thoughts turned to the clues she had uncovered. The letter mentioned by Maurice and Leonid, the contract dispute overheard by the TANF, the mysterious man from London. These were threads in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple sensed that the Theatre Royal held the key to their connection. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead's scandal, where a hidden letter had revealed a secret engagement. Here, too, she suspected a written word held the answer to Elise's fate. A soft creak interrupted her thoughts, and she glanced toward the aisle. A figure moved in the shadows near the stage door, too quick to identify, slipping out of sight. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. In her village, she had once caught a thief by noting such furtive movements. Here, she suspected, someone was equally eager to avoid notice. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way toward the backstage area, her excuse about the brooch ready if questioned. The corridor was lined with crates and costume racks, the air thick with the scent of paint and old fabric. A janitor, an older man with a grizzled beard, was sweeping near the props room, his movements slow and methodical. Miss Marple approached, her smile warm and disarming. "Good evening," she said softly. "I seem to have lost a brooch during the performance the other night. Might I look around? I was near the dressing rooms." The janitor squinted at her, then shrugged. "No harm in it, ma'am, but the police have been through there already. Doubt you'll find anything." "You're very kind," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "I won't be long." She moved toward Elise's dressing room, now unguarded but still sealed with police tape. Slipping beneath it, she entered the small, elegant space, its mirror still lined with telegrams of praise, the wilted rose with its black ribbon untouched on the dressing table. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, searching for what the police might have missed. Her eyes fell on a small waste bin in the corner, its contents undisturbed since her last visit. She sifted through it carefully, her gloved fingers uncovering a crumpled scrap of paper beneath a layer of tissue. It was a note written in a hurried, angular hand. "Meet me at the old warehouse, midnight." C. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. The initial C could only point to Clara Henshaw, whose efficiency and ambition had already raised her suspicions. She tucked the note into her handbag, her mind racing. The warehouse, she knew from village gossip, was a derelict building near the docks, recently purchased by a property firm linked to the Grand Ballet Troupe. The connection was too stark to ignore. She left the dressing room, her steps silent, and made her way to the props room, where the seamstress had mentioned overhearing Clara and Elise's tense exchange. The room was empty now, its racks of costumes casting eerie shadows in the lamplight. Miss Marple paused by a table piled with props, her eyes catching a glint of metal. A small key, half hidden beneath a velvet cloth. She picked it up, noting its worn industrial design, unlike the delicate keys of the theater. A warehouse key, perhaps? She slipped it into her bag, her thoughts turning to a saint. Mary Mead blacksmith, who had once hidden a stolen key to cover his tracks. As she stepped into the corridor, she heard voices, low, urgent, coming from the rehearsal studio. She moved closer, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow, and peered through the slightly ajar door. Inside, Clara stood with a man Miss Marple did not recognize, his tailored coat and polished shoes marking him as an outsider, perhaps the city gentleman mentioned by the seamstress and Isabel. Their words were indistinct, but Clara's tone was sharp, her gestures tense. The man nodded curtly and left through a side door, his departure swift and silent. Miss Marple retreated to the auditorium, her mind piecing together the fragments. The note, the key, the warehouse, the grand ballet troupe. These were no mere coincidences. Clara's ambition, she suspected, was not just to manage the Theatre Royal, but to secure its ruin for her own gain. In St. Mary Mead, a merchant had once sabotaged a rival's business for profit, and Miss Marple saw a similar ruthlessness in Clara's calculated demeanor. She returned to her seat, her knitting untouched as she considered her next move. The warehouse was the key, but she could not investigate alone. She would need Inspector Craddock's assistance, though she knew he would require more than her intuition. The note and key, however, were tangible, and she would present them to him tomorrow. For now, she sat in the quiet auditorium, the stage before her, a silent witness to a drama far darker than Swan Lake. The truth of Elise Varnier's disappearance was close, and Miss Marple, with her unerring instinct for human nature, felt its shadow drawing near. Chapter 9. The Warehouse Revelation. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a sharp bite, the kind that heralded winter's approach, and Miss Jane Marple pulled her shawl closer as she made her way to the police station. Her handbag, heavier with the weight of the note and key from the Theatre Royal, felt like a talisman of the truth she was closing in on. The note, "Meet me at the old warehouse, midnight, C." And the industrial key pointed to a plot far darker than a dancer's whim, and Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on Clara Henshaw, whose calculated demeanor had begun to unravel in her mind. The warehouse, linked to the grand ballet troupe, was no mere coincidence, and she sensed that Elise Varnier's fate lay within its crumbling walls. In St. Mary Mead, she had once traced a missing girl to a shed by following a single clue. Here, too, she trusted her instincts to lead her to the vanished ballerina. The police station, a squat brick building on the village's edge, bustled with quiet efficiency. Inspector Craddock, his desk piled with reports, greeted her with a mix of respect and exasperation, his square jaw set in a familiar frown. "Miss Marple," he said, rising to offer her a chair. "I should have known you'd turn up with something. You've got that look, same one you had during that business with the vicar's silver." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "You're too kind, Inspector. I've only a small matter to share, but I think it may be important." She opened her handbag and placed the note and key on his desk, her movements deliberate but unhurried. "I found these in the theater, yesterday. The note was in Miss Varnier's dressing room, and the key was among the props. I believe they point to the old warehouse by the docks, the one owned by a firm tied to the grand ballet troupe." Craddock's brow furrowed as he examined the note, his fingers tracing the angular handwriting. "See," he muttered. "Clara Henshaw, you think? It's bold, leaving a note like this." He picked up the key, turning it over in his hand. "And this fits a warehouse lock, you say?" I can't be certain, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. But it's not a theater key, and the warehouse has been mentioned in connection with the grand ballet troupe. Miss Henshaw's reaction when I mentioned them was telling. In our village, I once found a key that unlocked a shed full of secrets. I believe this one may do the same. Craddock leaned back, his expression skeptical but intrigued. You're suggesting Clara lured Elise to the warehouse. To what end? Kidnapping? Blackmail? He shook his head. It's a stretch, Miss Marple. Clara's ambitious, but she's no criminal mastermind. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. Ambition can make criminals of us all, Inspector. In St. Mary Mead, a shopkeeper once hid a rival's goods to ruin his trade. Clara's control over the company, her tension with Elise, and her ties to the grand ballet troupe, they suggest a motive rooted in gain, not passion. I think a visit to the warehouse might clarify things. Craddock sighed, but his respect for her instincts won out. All right, Miss Marple, I'll organize a search, but I want you there to explain this to the sergeant. He'll think I've gone mad, taking tips from a civilian. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. An old woman, you mean? I'm quite used to it, Inspector. By noon, a small police contingent, led by Craddock and accompanied by Miss Marple, arrived at the old warehouse near the docks. The building loomed like a forgotten relic, its brick walls weathered, its windows boarded or broken. The river nearby lapped sluggishly, its surface gray under the overcast sky. The key fit the rusted lock with a satisfying click, and the door creaked open, revealing a cavernous interior filled with shadows and the musty scent of neglect. Crates and old scenery flats littered the floor, and a faint draft carried the sound of dripping water. Miss Marple, her shawl a splash of gray against the gloom, followed Craddock and two constables inside, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Careful now," Craddock said, his torch cutting through the shadows. "If she's here, we don't want to startle anyone." They moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Miss Marple's gaze darted to the corners, where cobwebs hung like curtains. She recalled a saint, Mary Mead Barn, where a missing boy had been found, tied and frightened but alive, and she hoped for a similar resolution. A faint sound, a muffled thump, came from the far end of the building, and Craddock signaled for silence. They approached a stack of crates, behind which a small padlocked door was set into the wall. The key from the theater fit perfectly, and Craddock pushed the door open, revealing a cramped storage room. There, bound to a chair with her wrists tied and a gag loose around her neck, was Elise Varnier. Her dark hair was disheveled, her face pale but defiant, and her eyes widened with relief at the sight of Craddock's uniform. "Elise," Craddock exclaimed, moving to untie her. "Are you hurt?" Elise shook her head, her voice hoarse as the gag was removed. "No, but Clara. She did this. She tricked me, brought me here after the performance, said it was about a contract, a new role with the grand ballet troupe, but it was a lie. She wanted me gone, to ruin the Theatre Royal." Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression calm, but her mind racing. "Miss Varnier," she said gently, "can you tell us why? What did Clara hope to gain?" Elise's eyes flashed with anger. "She's been negotiating with the grand ballet troupe for months. They wanted me, offered me a lead in their season. I refused. I'm loyal to the Royale. Clara saw it as a betrayal, said I was holding the company back. She thought if I disappeared, the Royale would falter, and she could secure a deal with the troupe. Maybe a position for herself, or a payout. She planned to find me later, blame it on a stalker, make herself the hero. Craddock's face hardened as he helped Elise to her feet. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Elise nodded, pointing to a satchel in the corner. Her notes are in there, letters to the troupe, drafts of her plan. She thought I wouldn't see them, but I did before she tied me up. Miss Marple moved to the satchel, her gloved hands careful as she opened it. Inside were several documents, including a letter addressed to the Grand Ballet Troupe's director, outlining a scheme to neutralize the Royale's star to weaken its standing. The handwriting matched the note from Elise's dressing room, and Miss Marple's lips curved in quiet satisfaction. It was like finding a hidden ledger in St. Mary Mead, exposing a merchant's fraud. As the constables escorted Elise to safety, Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of admiration and disbelief. "You were right, as usual. How did you know?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "I didn't, Inspector, but people are much the same, whether in a village or a theater. Ambition, like greed, leaves traces. Clara's were just a bit clearer than most." They returned to the station, where Elise was given tea and a blanket, her strength returning with each sip. Clara, summoned for questioning, arrived with her usual composure, but when confronted with the satchel's contents, her facade crumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, and she sank into a chair, her ambition laid bare. "I only wanted a better future," she whispered. "For me, for the company." Miss Marple watched in silence, her thoughts on a St. Mary Mead woman who had justified her lies with similar words. The truth, as always, had a way of surfacing, and Elise Varnier, though shaken, was free to dance again. Chapter 10. The Denouement. The Theatre Royale's auditorium was bathed in the soft glow of its house lights, the velvet seats filled with an expectant hush as the principal figures of the company gathered at Inspector Craddock's summons. The heavy curtains of the stage hung still, a silent backdrop to the drama about to unfold. Miss Jane Marple sat unobtrusively in the third row, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm, and she sensed that the truth, like a long-rehearsed ballet, was ready to take center stage. Inspector Craddock stood at the foot of the stage, his notebook tucked away, his expression one of quiet authority. Beside him stood Elise Varnier, her face pale but composed, her dancer's poise unbroken despite her ordeal. Maurice Duval, Leonid Petrov, Isabel Crane, and Clara Henshaw were seated in the front row, their faces a study in contrasts, Maurice's taut with unease, Leonid's heavy with relief, Isabel's brittle with apprehension, and Clara's a mask of icy control. The rest of the company, dancers, stagehands, and crew, filled the seats behind, their whispers fading as Craddock raised a hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "Miss Varnier has been found, safe but shaken, in a warehouse near the docks. Her disappearance was no accident, nor a flight of fancy, but a calculated act. And tonight, we will lay bare the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Miss Marple's eyes were fixed on Clara, whose hands tightened imperceptibly on the armrests of her chair. Craddock continued, detailing the discovery at the warehouse, the note with the initial C, the key, and Elise's account of her captivity. As he spoke, Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding attention despite her unassuming air. "If I may, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "I'd like to offer a few observations. This affair reminds me of a story from my village, Saint Mary Mead, where a merchant once hid a rival's goods to ruin his trade. Ambition, you see, can twist even the most orderly mind into something quite ruthless." She stepped forward, her shawl slipping slightly as she addressed the gathering. Miss Varnier's disappearance was not a random act, nor the work of passion, as I first wondered when speaking to Mr. Duval and Mr. Petrov. She glanced at Maurice and Leonid, who shifted uncomfortably. Their devotion to Elise, though intense, was genuine, born of art and love, not malice. Nor was it Miss Crane's ambition, sharp though it is, that led to this crime. Isabel's eyes widened, a mix of relief and indignation crossing her face. Miss Marple turned to Clara, her gaze steady but kind. "No, the answer lies with Miss Henshaw, whose efficiency and ambition were the threads that wove this plot. Clara, you see, had ties to the Grand Ballet Troupe, a rival company eager to eclipse the Theatre Royal. When Elise refused their offer of a lead role, you saw an opportunity, not to join them, but to sabotage your own company for personal gain." Clara's face paled, but her voice was sharp. "This is absurd. I've worked tirelessly for this company. Why would I harm it?" Miss Marple's lips curved into a gentle smile. "Why, indeed. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a woman who betrayed her own charity for a promise of power. You, Miss Henshaw, were promised a position with the Grand Ballet Troupe, weren't you? A directorship, perhaps, if you could weaken the Royale. You lured Elise to the warehouse with a false promise of a contract, locked her away to create a scandal, and planned to rescue her later, blaming a fictitious stalker. The Royale's reputation would falter, its funding would dry up, and the troupe would rise." Clara stood, her hands clenched. "You have no proof. This is all conjecture." Miss Marple drew the note, the key, and the cigarette case from her handbag, holding them up like props in a play. "These tell a different story. The note, signed with your initial, lured Elise to the warehouse. The key unlocked her prison. And this cigarette case, with your initials, was left behind in your haste. Small things. But in my village, I've seen smaller unravel greater crimes." Elise stepped forward, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "It was you, Clara. You promised me a solo tour, but when I arrived, you locked the door. I heard you speaking to a man outside, a man from the troupe, I'm sure. You wanted the Royale to fail." Craddock nodded, his expression grim. "We've identified the man, a representative of the Grand Ballet Troupe. He's in custody and has confirmed your involvement, Miss Henshaw. You're under arrest." Clara's composure shattered, her shoulders slumping as she sank back into her seat, tears streaming down her face. "I only wanted a chance to be more," she whispered. "The Royale was suffocating me." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained firm. "Ambition is no crime, my dear, but betrayal is. You saw Elise as a pawn, not a person, and that was your mistake." As the constables led Clara away, the auditorium erupted in whispers, the company stunned by the revelation. Maurice rose, his face a mix of relief and sorrow, and approached Elise, murmuring apologies for his harshness. Leonid followed, his eyes brimming with unspoken devotion. Isabel, her ambition tempered by the truth, sat silent, her hands clasped tightly. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting bag untouched. Craddock approached, his smile wry. "You've done it again, Miss Marple. I don't know how you see these things." She smiled, adjusting her shawl. "I only watch, Inspector, as I do in my village. People are much the same, whether on a stage or in a garden. They leave their traces, if you know where to look." As the crowd dispersed, Elise approached, her eyes bright with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'll dance again, because of you." Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice warm. "And I shall come to watch, my dear. The stage needs your light." She left the theater, the night air cool against her face. The mystery of the vanished ballerina was solved, but St. Mary Mead, she knew, would soon offer another puzzle. With her umbrella tapping softly, Miss Marple walked home, her mind already turning to the quiet dramas that awaited.